In March of 2008, 3 years before the wave, a team of engineers printed one number: 15.7 meters. That was the tsunami that could strike the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. The wall in front of it was built to stop a wave of 5.7. They had the number, they read it. Then they decided the expensive problem was the knowledge, not the ocean, and they shelved it. On the 11th of March, 2011, the sea came over that wall exactly as their own engineers had said it would. A region became uninhabitable. 44 people died, being carried out of their hospital beds. And the part that should make you angry is that none of it was a surprise. The same wave had already struck once, in the year 869, and the sand it left is still in the ground where anyone could have read it. Tonight, we follow the whole chain, from the cliff they cut down to save money, to the engineer up the coast who built his plant higher and watched it survive, to the courts that spent a decade unable to decide whether anyone was to blame. So get comfortable and subscribe or join if you have not already, because this is not a story about one wall in Japan. It is the reason the next disaster is already being built by people with no reason to stop. The deeper, wider version of these stories lives over on the Patreon. Stay to the end, because by then you will understand why nobody was incentivized to ask why, and you will start seeing the same short wall everywhere, even in your own life. Let's go back to where this began. The wave that destroyed the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant had already happened once. It happened in the year 869. Somebody wrote it down, and the sand it pushed across the plain that day is still in the ground, sitting under a layer of volcanic ash, exactly where it settled 1100 years ago, waiting for someone to read it. Somebody did read it. That is the part you need to sit with before anything else. The wave was not a surprise. It was not an act of God. It was not, whatever you were told in March of 2011, an event that exceeded all human expectation. The expectation existed. It had a number attached to it. In March of 2008, 3 full years before the ocean came over the wall, an engineering team working for the company that ran the plant finished a calculation and produced a figure: the maximum tsunami that could strike the southern face of Fukushima Daiichi. 15.7 meters. The wall in front of the plant was built to stop a wave of 5.7 meters. I want to be precise about what that means, because the gap between those two numbers is the entire story, and almost everyone who talks about this disaster talks around it. The people running the plant were not blind. They were not ignorant. They were not waiting for science that did not yet exist. They had the science. They commissioned it themselves. They held in their hands, in a quiet office in Tokyo, a document that described almost exactly what was going to happen, 3 years before it happened. And the response to that document was not to build a higher wall. The response was to ask whether the document could be made to go away. And here is the part that should genuinely disturb you, the part I keep coming back to. They were not even wrong. That is the thing. If they had been wrong, if they had simply made a bad guess and gotten unlucky, this would be a sad story about human fallibility, and you could close the tab and feel nothing in particular. But they were not wrong. They got it right. The calculation was almost perfect. And they built the short wall anyway, not in spite of knowing. In a strange, specific, documented way, they built the short wall because of how the knowing was structured. because nobody in the entire chain of people who could have raised that wall was ever going to be rewarded for raising it, and several of them were going to be punished. You have made the same kind of trade, probably this week. We will come back to that, and when we do it, it's going to feel worse than it sounds right now. For the moment, hold on to the two numbers, 5.7, 15.7, and the question that sits underneath this entire story and never closes, no matter how deep we go. When a catastrophe is foreseeable and foreseen and written down with a number and still not prevented, who exactly failed? Hold that question loosely, because every answer we reach for is going to slip. The obvious villain is going to turn out to be innocent in a way that is more frightening than guilt. And by the end, I think you will understand why a Japanese court, after more than a decade, looking at all of it, the calculation, the email, the buried report, the bodies, could not decide whether a single human being was responsible. Let me show you how the wall got to be 5.7 meters tall, because the wall did not start at 5.7. It started lower, and the way it got its height tells you everything about which century it was built for. When the plant was designed in the 1960s, the engineers needed a design basis, a number to build against. The single largest tsunami the defenses had to survive. They chose 3.1 meters. 3.1. And they did not pull that number out of the air. They had a real event to point to. In May of 1960, a magnitude 9.5 earthquake off the coast of Chile, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded anywhere on the planet, sent a tsunami across the entire Pacific. It reached Japan most of a day later. At Onagawa port, just south of where the plant would be built, the water rose about 3 meters. So they took that, the worst thing in living memory, the worst thing the tide gauges had ever printed, and they built to match it, with a margin. 3.1 meters. Think about the logic there, because it is completely reasonable and it is the seed of the whole catastrophe. They asked, what is the biggest wave we have seen? They built for that. It is the way you decide how high to build a flood wall, how strong to make a bridge, how much you need in your savings account. You look at the worst thing that has happened to you, you add a little, and you call it safe. It is the most natural reasoning in the world, and it has a fatal flaw built directly into it, a flaw with a name, which we will get to. The flaw is this: the worst thing that has happened to you is not the worst thing that can happen to you. It is just the worst thing that has happened to you so far. The tide gauge at Onagawa had only existed for a few decades. The ocean had been there for 4 billion years. The plant was built to survive the memory of the tide gauge. The bluff came next, and the bluff is where you should start to feel the cold. The plant did not have to sit at 10 meters above the sea. The natural ground at that site was a cliff, roughly 35 meters high. 35. A wall of rock, more than twice the height of the wave that was eventually going to come. If they had simply built the plant on top of the land that was already there, on the bluff as the ocean had left it, there would have been no disaster. The wave that drowned 3 reactors in 2011 would have washed against the base of a cliff and gone home. Fukushima Daiichi would be a footnote, a plant that had a scary afternoon during a big earthquake and was fine. They cut the cliff down. They took 35 meters of solid ground and they carved away 25 meters of it, and they set the reactors at 10. There were reasons. There are always reasons, and the reasons are never stupid. That is what makes this kind of story so much worse than a story about stupidity. One reason was bedrock. Sitting the reactor foundations directly on solid rock made them more stable in an earthquake, and in an earthquake country that is not nothing. But the other reason, the one that matters for our story, was the seawater pumps. A nuclear plant is a machine for boiling water, and to carry the heat away it needs to suck in an enormous volume of cold seawater, constantly, forever. The higher you sit the plant above the ocean, the more energy and money it costs to lift that water up to it. Every second for the entire 40-year operating life of the station. Drop the plant from 35 meters to 10 meters and you save a fortune in pumping costs. Every day, for 40 years. So they cut the cliff down to save money on pumps. I am not editorializing when I say that. It is in the construction history. They lowered the single most effective tsunami defense the site had, the height of the land itself, and they did it for an operating cost calculation. The mountain that would have saved the plant was removed because the mountain was expensive to pump water up to. And nobody was wrong to do it. The pumping savings were real. The bedrock stability was real. Every individual reason held up. That is the pattern. Keep watching for it. Every single decision in this story, taken on its own, on the day it was made, by the person who made it, was defensible. The disaster is not in any one decision. The disaster is in the sum. By 2002, the 5.7-meter wall had arrived, and it arrived through something that looks almost like diligence. The Japan Society of Civil Engineers published a new method for estimating tsunami risk, and the company, to its credit, applied it. Voluntarily, the new method said the design basis at Daiichi should be raised from 3.1 meters to 5.7. So they raised it. They sealed and lifted some of the seawater pumps to cope with the higher water. On paper, this is a safety improvement. A company looking at new science and revising upward. The system working. But look at what that number now meant. 5.7 meters. The seawater pumps sat at 4 meters above the sea. The revised wave was 1.7 meters higher than the pumps that cooled the reactors. By the company's own new estimate, the design wave would now reach the pumps and submerge them. That should have triggered a formal regulatory review, a reopening of the plant's license, a hard look at whether the whole cooling arrangement still made sense. It triggered nothing. The regulator, an agency we are going to spend real time with because it is one of the quiet monsters of this story, never updated the plant's licensing documents to reflect the new number. The 5.7-meter figure existed in the company's files and effectively nowhere else. The plant kept running against a license that still described a 3.1-meter world. The science moved. The paperwork did not. And a senior official at the regulator later confirmed to investigators that the agency had neither commissioned nor reviewed any detailed study of how high the water would actually climb if it came. They accepted the number and filed it. That is the first time in this story that the people who were supposed to be guarding the public simply were not in the room. It is not the last. Start counting now, because by the end, the count is going to be the point. The regulator that did not review the number. That is one. Now we reach 2008, and the calculation that should have ended this story years before it became a tragedy. The company was already running a tsunami review, prompted by a large earthquake in northern Japan the year before. As part of that review, an engineering group inside the company took the most authoritative source available. The Japanese government's own long-term earthquake assessment, which warned that a massive quake could strike anywhere along the Japan Trench off the Tohoku coast. And they did the obvious thing. They ran the numbers for what such a quake would do to the plant. They modeled the wave. The model came back with a maximum run-up on the southern side of the site of 15.7 meters. Some of the calculations in that same body of work produced water heights of better than 10 meters at the plant face, with the southern slopes seeing close to 16. These were not scribbles. These were formal trial calculations produced by a company subsidiary, reported up the chain to senior management, to the executive vice president level. The men running the nuclear division of one of the largest power companies on Earth were told in 2008 in writing that the plant they were responsible for could be hit by a wave nearly 3 times as high as the wall protecting it. What happened next is the hinge of the entire disaster, and it is so mundane that it barely registers as a decision at all, which is exactly why it should frighten you. In July of 2008, the executive responsible, a man named Sake Muto, looked at the 15.7-meter figure and did not order a higher wall. He did not order the generators moved. He ordered that the estimate be studied further. He referred the question to the Civil Engineers Society for additional examination of whether the government's assessment was really reliable enough to act on. He asked for more time and more expert review. And in the structure of how these things work, asking for more study was, functionally, a decision to do nothing. The countermeasures that had been sketched out in March were shelved in July. Not cancelled, not refused, shelved, sent back for more analysis, pending forever as it turned out, pending right up until the ocean answered the question for them. I need to stop here and be fair, because the fairness is part of the horror and skipping it would be a lie. The government assessment behind the 15.7-meter number was genuinely contested. It was a long-term probabilistic statement about the whole Japan Trench, and it had not been confirmed by the specific kind of source modeling that would let an engineer say, with certainty, a wave of this exact height will strike this exact spot. Reasonable scientists disagreed about how much weight it could bear. The estimate was real, but it was not a prophecy. And Muto was not staring at a guarantee. But watch what the uncertainty did. The uncertainty did not make them cautious. It made them comfortable. The doubt about the number did not become a reason to prepare for a range of outcomes, including the bad one. It became a reason to keep operating as if the bad one had been ruled out. This is the move. And once you see it, you will see it everywhere for the rest of your life. Genuine scientific uncertainty, which should widen the margin of safety, was instead used to justify doing nothing. Because as long as the number was not certain, acting on it was optional, and not acting was free. The fog of doubt did not slow them down. It gave them somewhere to hide. There is a sentence from inside the company that survives from this period, and it is the closest thing this story has to a confession. It surfaced years later, read into the record of a criminal trial, drawn from the company's own internal communications. A construction official, looking at the new and higher tsunami estimate, wrote that it made the plant's existing safety measures insufficient, and that what the company now needed was a logical excuse to keep the plant running. At a meeting around the same time, a tsunami of more than 10 meters was described internally as disastrous. They had the word, they used the word, disastrous, and then they went looking in writing, not for a way to prevent the disaster, but for a logical excuse to keep operating in front of it. Read that again slowly. The problem, as it was understood inside the building, was not the wave. The problem was that the knowledge of the wave threatened the operation of the plant. And so the task that the organization set itself was not to defeat the wave, it was to defeat the knowledge. They were better at the second task. They reported those 2008 simulations to the national regulator on the 7th of March, 2011, 4 days before the wave arrived. So the wall stayed at 5.7 meters. And on the afternoon of the 11th of March, 2011, the ocean came to collect on a debt that had been recorded 1100 years earlier and recalculated 3 years earlier, and it did not come at 5.7 meters. The earthquake hit first at 46 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, a magnitude 9, the most powerful ever recorded in Japan. The reactors that were running sensed it and shut themselves down automatically, exactly as designed. The control rods slammed home. The chain reaction stopped. For about 40 minutes, the plant was in a survivable situation. The grid power was gone, knocked out by the quake, but the emergency diesel generators had started, and they were doing their job, pushing water through the hot reactor cores to carry away the enormous residual heat that a nuclear core keeps producing for days after it stops. The decay heat that does not care that you have shut down, that has to be removed or the fuel will melt itself. For 40 minutes, the backup worked, and then the sea arrived. The tsunami that reached the plant came ashore at a height of roughly 13 to 15 meters. The exact maximum at the site will never be known with certainty because the instrument that would have measured it was itself destroyed by the water, which is its own small piece of dark poetry. But the trace the water left on the buildings tells the story well enough. The wave swept over the 5.7-meter wall as if it were a curb. It rolled across the 10-meter platform where the reactors sat, the platform that had been a 35-meter cliff before someone decided pumping was expensive, and it flooded the site to a depth of 4 to 5 meters of moving seawater. And it went into the basements. This is the detail that turns a flood into a meltdown, and it is the detail almost nobody understands, so I want to make sure you do, because it is the second great misconception about Fukushima, and correcting it changes what the whole disaster means. People believe that tsunami destroyed the reactors. It did not. The reactors survived the earthquake and survived the wave. What the wave destroyed was the electricity. The emergency diesel generators, the machines keeping the cooling water moving, the machines standing between a shut-down plant and a triple meltdown, had been installed in the basements and lower floors of the turbine buildings, down at the 10-meter level, in rooms that were not watertight. The seawater poured in on top of them. Of the 13 backup generators on the site, 12 drowned. The seawater cooling pumps, the ones at 4 meters, the ultimate connection to the ocean that was supposed to be the final heat sink, were swamped and stopped. The plant did not lose power because the wave was supernatural. The plant lost power because the most critical safety equipment in the entire facility, the last line of defense for 3 nuclear reactors, had been placed in the basement, below the height of a wave that the company's own engineers had calculated 3 years earlier. The meltdown did not come from the ocean. It came from where they put the generators. Sit with that, because it relocates the blame from nature to architecture, from the wave to the floor plan. The most dangerous decision at Fukushima Daiichi was not made on the 11th of March, 2011. It was made years before, on a drawing, by someone choosing where to put a machine, in a building, on a platform, on a cut-down cliff, behind a short wall, against a number from the wrong century. The wave just read the drawing back to them. By the evening, the cores were uncovering. Over the following days, the fuel in 3 reactors melted. Hydrogen built up and tore the buildings apart in explosions you have seen, even if you did not understand what you were looking at. More than 160,000 people would eventually leave their homes, some of them forever. And the wave that did all of this had a height that had been printed on a company document 3 years before, and a date in the historical record 1100 years before. And both of those facts were known. And neither of them moved the wall. But to understand how a society forgets a wave that it actually wrote down, you have to go back and meet the wave the first time it came. You have to go to the year 869. Because the most unsettling thing about Fukushima is not that the warning was ignored, it is that the warning was never really lost at all. It was sitting in the ground and in the oldest books in the country the entire time. The book is called the Nihon Sandai Jitsuroku, the true record of 3 reigns of Japan. It was compiled around the year 901, which makes it one of the 6 great official histories of the country, the kind of document a government keeps to record what actually happened on its watch. And in its account of the year 869, it describes the sea. It describes the ocean rising up and rolling inland across the Sendai plain, north of where the plant would one day stand. It describes the water covering the land and the castle town of Tagajo and people drowning. The number it gives for the dead is about 1,000. 1,000 people in a sparsely populated coastal province in the 9th century, killed by a single wave on a single afternoon. The chroniclers did not have the word tsunami in the sense we use it. They had something better in a way. They had eyewitnesses, and they wrote down what the eyewitnesses saw, and what the eyewitnesses saw was the sea coming to the foot of the mountains. That account sat in the historical record for 1100 years. It was never lost. Any scholar of early Japanese history could have read it, and many did. It was, by the late 20th century, a known event with a name: the Jogan earthquake, the Jogan tsunami, after the era in which it occurred. The problem was that a line in a 1,000-year-old chronicle, however vivid, is not something a modern engineer can build against. You cannot derive a wall height from a sentence about the sea reaching the mountains. The chronicle could tell you that something terrible had happened. It could not tell you how high the water rose, or how far inland it reached, or how big the earthquake was that caused it. For that, you do not need a historian. You need someone willing to dig in the mud. And in the 1990s, someone did. This is where the human thread of this story really begins. And it begins not with the people who ran the plant, but with the people who were quietly, patiently, for decades, assembling the exact warning that the plant would ignore. A geologist named Koji Minura, working with colleagues, went looking for the physical fingerprint of the Jogan wave, because a tsunami does not just kill people and recede, it leaves a signature. When a wall of seawater surges across a coastal plain, it carries sand from the beach and the seafloor far inland, and when the water finally stops and drains away, that sand settles out and stays. It becomes a thin layer, buried over the following centuries under the ordinary mud and soil of the plain. A pale band of marine sand sandwiched in the dark earth, kilometers from any beach, where no ordinary process could ever have put it. Find that layer, trace how far inland it reaches, measure how thick it is and what it is made of, and you can reverse engineer the wave. The sand remembers the size of the thing that carried it. Minura and his colleagues found the Jogan sand. They found it across the Sendai plain. a sheet of well-sorted marine sand lying in the soil up to several kilometers inland from the coast. And they could date it with real confidence because of a second piece of luck buried in the same ground. In the year 915, a few decades after the Jogan wave, a volcano called Tawada erupted and dropped a distinctive layer of ash across the whole region. That ash layer, the Tawada ash, is a clock. Anything below it is older than 915. Anything above it is younger. And the Jogan tsunami sand lies just below the Tawada ash, exactly where an 869 event should lie. The chronicle and the sediment agreed. The wave was real, and it was enormous, and it had thrown the sea kilometers across the plain. In a paper published in 2001, Minura and his co-authors did the thing the engineers needed. They estimated the earthquake. To push sand that far inland, the source had to be a magnitude in the low to mid-8 range, something like magnitude 8.3, a colossal event. And then they did the thing that should have stopped your breath if you were a safety official reading it. They looked at the older sand layers beneath the Jogan one, the fingerprints of even earlier waves, and they calculated how often this happened. The recurrence interval. How long between giant tsunamis on this coast? Their answer was roughly 1,000 years, and the Jogan wave had been 1,100 years ago. I want you to feel the precise shape of what that paper was saying, because it was published in 2001, 10 years before the disaster, in a scientific journal by named researchers, available to anyone. It was saying that the Sendai coast suffers a catastrophic tsunami roughly once a millennium. It was saying the last one was the Jogan event of 869. And it was saying, therefore, in the cold arithmetic, that the authors were too careful to spell out, but that any competent reader could finish for themselves, that the coast was due, that the clock had run almost all the way down, that the thing was not a question of whether, but of when, and the when was now. Geologically speaking, which on a human calendar means any year, including this one. That was not the only warning, and the others kept coming, louder, right up to the edge of the disaster. Other researchers extended the work, a team led by the geologist Yuki Sawai, working with the seismologist Kenji Satake, who is one of the most respected tsunami scientists in the world, kept digging along the coast through the 2000s. They cored the sediments at hundreds of locations along nearly 200 kilometers of coastline. They refined the recurrence estimate to somewhere in the range of 500 to 800 years between giant events, which if anything made the situation more urgent, not less. And in 2012, the year after the disaster, they published the work that had been underway for years in a major international journal. The title of that paper is one of the most haunting things I have ever read in scientific literature. It is called, in plain English, The Challenge of Anticipating the 2011 Tohoku Earthquake and Tsunami Using Coastal Geology. Think about what that title is. It is a group of scientists in the immediate aftermath of the worst nuclear accident since Chernobyl, publishing the research that had been describing exactly that catastrophe before it happened, and titling it, with devastating restraint, an account of how hard it is to get anyone to listen to the ground. The warning and the autopsy were the same document. The people reading the sand had been reading it correctly the entire time. There is a line in that body of work, an almost confessional aside from the scientists, that captures the genuine difficulty here, and I want to give it to you, because the channel does not do villains where there are none. Even excellent geology, one of them noted, cannot lead you to the conclusion of the largest possible earthquake, meaning the ground tells you what has happened, not the absolute ceiling of what could. The scientists were honest about the limits of their own evidence. They were not claiming prophecy. They were claiming something more modest and more damning. They were claiming that the coast had a 1,000-year cycle of devastation, that the cycle was nearly complete, and that any responsible institution should be planning for the wave they could see coming in the sediment. So the warning was not buried. That is the thing I keep returning to. The warning was published. It was in the official history of the nation, and it was in the peer-reviewed literature, and it was in the layers of sand under the rice fields. The information was not missing. Something else was missing. And we know exactly what was missing, because there is a moment, a specific meeting on a specific day, where the warning was carried directly into the room with the people who licensed the plant, and was looked at, and was set down, and was walked past. If the buried sand is the warning, this meeting is the abdication. And it is the third place in this story where the people who were supposed to be guarding the public were simply not there in any way that mattered. In June of 2009, the national regulator convened an expert panel to review the seismic safety of Fukushima Daiichi. Around the table were officials from the regulator and from the company and outside experts. And one of those experts was a seismologist named Yukinobu Okamura, who directed a government research center on active faults and earthquakes, and who knew the Jogan work intimately, because his own field was precisely the study of these ancient, recurring, devastating events written in the coastal sediment. Okamura looked at the safety review the panel was about to approve, and he noticed that the Jogan tsunami was not in it. The single most relevant event in the entire geological history of that coast, the 1,000-year wave whose anniversary was overdue, had simply been left out of the document certifying that the plant was safe against tsunamis. And Okamura, to his lasting credit, said so. On the record, he asked the panel why they had not touched on the Jogan event at all. He said, and this is close to his actual words, that he found it unacceptable. A company official pushed back, calling the Jogan tsunami a historic matter, something old, something that did not need to constrain a modern safety assessment. And Okamura, not letting it go, said he did not understand how that conclusion could be drawn, that to have no mention of the Jogan event at all left him unsatisfied. A regulator official promised that the matter would be followed up. At the next meeting, the working group approved the safety report. The report declared the plant's tsunami defenses sufficient. The Jogan objection had been heard, noted, promised a follow-up, and then driven over. The man who had read the ground correctly said, in the room, on the record, that the assessment was unacceptable, and the assessment was accepted anyway. That is the regulator, again, not in the room in any sense that counts. That is two. I have spent a long time trying to understand the psychology of that meeting, because it is, in miniature, the whole disaster. Nobody at that table was evil. Nobody wanted a meltdown. The company official who called Jogan historic was not lying in any simple sense. From inside the institution, an event from the 9th century, attested by a 1,000-year-old chronicle and some sand, must genuinely have felt like a curiosity rather than a design constraint. The modern, recent, measured tsunamis, the ones the tide gauges had recorded, those felt real. The ancient one felt like history. And the entire engineering culture was built to take the recent and measured seriously, and to treat the ancient and inferred as background. But the ocean does not distinguish between a wave it sent in 1960 and a wave it sent in 869. To the ocean, they are the same kind of event, separated by an eye blink. The distinction between recent history and deep history is something that exists only inside human institutions, and it is lethal, and it has a name, and we are almost ready to give it that name. But not yet, because first I have to show you the man who looked at the same coast, the same ocean, the same ancient waves, and did the opposite, the man who built it higher. Because his existence proves that none of this was inevitable. Every excuse the company would later make, that the wave was unforeseeable, that the science was too uncertain, that no reasonable engineer could have prepared for such an event, all of it collapses against a single counterexample standing on the same coastline, hit by the same tsunami, on the same afternoon, that did not melt down. And the reason it did not melt down is that one stubborn man, decades earlier, refused to build for the wrong century. His name was Yanosuke Hirai. He was born in 1902 and he died in 1986, 25 years before the wave came that would prove him right. He was a civil engineer and he rose to become a vice president of Tohoku Electric, a different power company, the one that built the Onagawa nuclear plant up the coast, closer to the eventual epicenter than Fukushima Daiichi. And in 1968, when the Onagawa plant was being planned, Hirai sat on the committee deciding how high above the sea to build it, and he did something that everyone around him thought was excessive, expensive, and faintly ridiculous. He insisted on 14.8 meters. The expected tsunami at the site, by the standards of the day, was around 3 meters. The same kind of number Fukushima was built against. His colleagues thought a wall and a platform sized for something like 12 meters was already generous, more than enough, a comfortable margin over anything the recent record suggested. Hirai wanted nearly 15. He wanted to build for a wave 5 times larger than the one the modern data predicted. And his reason was not modern data. His reason was that he had read the old records. He knew about the Jogan tsunami of 869. He knew about a more recent monster, the Keicha tsunami of 1611, that had also savaged this coast. He looked at the deep history, the ancient waves that the institutions around him were treating as curiosities, and he took them literally, as descriptions of what the ocean was actually capable of doing to this specific shore. He was, by the accounts of the people who worked with him, difficult about it. Obsessive. One former subordinate described Hirai's fixation on safety as a constant battle he waged against institutional inertia. He fought his own colleagues. He fought the comfortable consensus that the recent record was good enough. There is a line attributed to him that I think about a great deal. If you do not think about tsunamis in Tohoku, he is supposed to have said, then what are you thinking about? He understood, in a way that the entire culture around him did not, that on that particular coast, the tsunami was not an edge case. It was the main event. It was the thing the ocean there does. He won the argument. The plant was built at 14.8 meters, and he was not done. He also designed the cooling water intake so that it would keep working even during the drawdown of a tsunami, the moment when the sea sucks backward and the water level drops far below normal before the wave returns. A failure mode that has killed other coastal plants. He thought about the wave from every direction. He built for the ocean he had read about in the chronicles, not the ocean the tide gauges had measured in his lifetime. On the 11th of March, 2011, the Onagawa plant was closer to the magnitude 9 earthquake than Fukushima Daiichi was. The tsunami that struck it was, by some measures, larger than the one that struck Fukushima, somewhere over 14 meters. The water came up the slope toward the plant, and it stopped short. The wave reached to within about a meter of the plant level and went no further, because the plant level was where a dead man had insisted on putting it 43 years earlier. The reactors at Onagawa shut down and cooled and were, in the words of an international inspection team that visited afterward, remarkably undamaged. The plant was in such good condition that it became a refuge. More than 300 local residents whose homes had been destroyed by the tsunami sheltered inside the nuclear plant, because it was the safest, most intact structure for miles. I want you to hold the two images side by side, because together they destroy the central lie that the company and the government would tell for years afterward. On the same coast, on the same afternoon, hit by waves from the same earthquake, one nuclear plant melted down and rendered a region uninhabitable, and another nuclear plant sheltered the refugees. The difference was not luck. The difference was not that one wave was supernatural and the other was ordinary. The wave at Onagawa was bigger. The difference was a number chosen decades earlier by people with different relationships to the deep history of the same ocean. Fukushima built for the recent past. Onagawa built for the ancient one. The ocean, indifferent as always, tested both, and the test was not close. So when you hear that Fukushima was unforeseeable, that no reasonable engineer could have prepared for such a wave, that the disaster exceeded all expectation, remember Hirai. Remember that the expectation was not exceeded. The expectation was met by at least one man 43 years early and acted on, and it worked. The wave was foreseeable because it was foreseen, and it was foreseen because someone bothered to read the same warning that everyone else walked past. The science was not the problem. The science was sitting in the same chronicles and the same sediment for both companies. What differed was whether anyone in the chain of decisions was willing to spend money on a ghost. And that brings us to the real machinery of this disaster, the thing underneath the short wall and the basement generators and the dismissed objection, the thing the title of this story points at. Nobody was incentivized to ask why. I have been showing you what happened. Now I have to show you the structure that made what happened the rational outcome. Because until you see the structure, you will keep reaching for the wrong explanation, which is that bad people did a bad thing. That is not what happened. What happened is much worse than that, and much harder to fix, because there were almost no bad people in it at all. Start with the regulator, because I have been promising you the regulator, and now you get the full picture. The body responsible for nuclear safety in Japan at the time of the disaster was an agency called the Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency, and the single most important fact about it is where it sat. It was housed inside the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, the same ministry whose job was to promote nuclear power. The agency meant to police the industry was a division of the agency meant to grow the industry. The watchdog and the salesman worked for the same boss. Try to design a system more certain to fail, and you will struggle. The regulator's funding, its career paths, its institutional prestige, all of it flowed through a ministry whose mission was more nuclear power, more cheaply, more quickly. An international inspection team had flagged exactly this problem, the apparent lack of independence of the regulator, years before the disaster. Japan did not publish that finding prominently or rush to fix it. The conflict of interest was not hidden, it was simply tolerated, because everyone inside the system benefited from tolerating it. and the benefits flowed through a specific, documented channel, a practice with its own name. Amakudari, it translates, beautifully and horribly, as descent from heaven. It is the practice of senior government regulators, on retirement, descending into comfortable, highly paid positions at the very companies they used to regulate. A vice presidency at the power company had, by one minister's own later admission, long been effectively reserved for a retiring official from the ministry. Think about what that does to a regulator who is 35 years old and ambitious. The companies you regulate are not your adversaries. They are your future employers, the executive across the table from you, the one whose plant you are supposed to be scrutinizing, holds the keys to the second half of your career. You do not have to be corrupt for this to work. You do not have to take a bribe or break a law. You simply have to be a normal human being who would like a good job someday, and the system does the rest. It bends you, gently, continuously, toward going easy. This whole interlocking arrangement, the utilities and the regulators and the politicians and the friendly academics and the compliant press, has a name in Japan. They call it the nuclear village, not a conspiracy, a village, a community of mutual interest where everyone knows everyone, where the same faces move between the company and the ministry and the advisory panel, where raising a real alarm means betraying not an institution, but a neighborhood. And the official investigation that eventually examined the disaster concluded that nuclear power in Japan had become, in its words, an unstoppable force immune to scrutiny by civil society. The village had no room in it for the person who insisted on the higher wall. The village was built, structurally, to produce the lower one. Now put the structure together with the calculation and watch the disaster assemble itself out of perfectly reasonable parts. A company runs a calculation and learns its plant needs an expensive upgrade. Admitting the need for the upgrade means admitting the plant is currently unsafe, which could force a shutdown, which costs enormous money and weakens the company in any lawsuit. The regulator that might force the issue is staffed by people who would like jobs at the company someday and works for a ministry that wants the plant running. The science behind the upgrade is genuinely uncertain, which gives everyone permission to wait for more study. And no individual in the entire chain, not the engineer, not the executive, not the regulator, will ever receive a single reward for the catastrophe that does not happen if they spend the money. Avert the disaster, and you have spent a fortune to prevent an event that, because you prevented it, no one will ever see. You will have nothing to show for it, but a smaller budget and a reputation as the person who panicked about a ghost. The official inquiry found this logic in writing. It concluded that from the company's perspective, new safety regulations would have interfered with plant operations and weakened its position in potential lawsuits, and that this was motivation enough for the company to actively oppose new safety rules and to drag out its negotiations with the regulator. The inquiry put it even more bluntly elsewhere. The decision makers, it found, either intentionally postponed putting safety measures in place or made decisions based on their organization's self-interest and not in the interest of public safety. And then, the most remarkable admission of all, in October of 2012, after the disaster, the company itself conceded the point. It admitted that it had failed to take the necessary measures out of fear of inviting lawsuits and public protests against its plants. The fear of the lawsuit was greater than the fear of the meltdown, because the lawsuit was certain to follow from admitting the risk, and the meltdown was only a probability and a contested one, and someone else's problem on some future afternoon. That is the answer to the question in the title. Nobody was incentivized to ask why, because asking why had no upside and enormous downside for every single person positioned to ask it. The short wall was not a mistake the system made. The short wall was the system working correctly, optimizing for exactly what it was built to optimize for, which was cheap power, smooth operations, and the avoidance of any admission that might trigger a cost today in exchange for safety on a day that might never come. The wall was the right height. For the incentives, it was only the wrong height for the ocean. And if you think this is a story about Japan, about a particular national culture of conformity and deference, about a flaw in them that is not a flaw in you, then I have saved the worst part for last, because the thing that killed Fukushima has a name that has nothing to do with Japan. It was identified by two American economists studying banks, and it is operating right now in your country, in your industry, and almost certainly in your own life. In 1986, two economists at Princeton, Jack Gutentag and Richard Herring, published a paper about international banking. It has nothing to do with nuclear power, nothing to do with tsunamis, nothing to do with Japan. It is about why banks, over and over, across centuries, lend themselves into catastrophes that everyone can see coming in hindsight and almost no one prepares for in advance. And in that paper, they named the thing that would kill Fukushima 25 years later. They called it disaster myopia. Here is the idea, and once it is in your head, you will not be able to get it out, which is appropriate, because the entire problem is that it keeps falling out of everyone's head. Disaster myopia is the systematic human tendency to underestimate the probability of low-frequency, high-severity events. Events that happen rarely but, when they happen, are enormous. And the key word is systematic. This is not random error. It is not stupidity. It is a structured, predictable bias that operates in roughly the same way in every human institution, and it has a specific, almost mechanical cause. The cause is that we estimate the probability of a disaster largely by how easily we can call an example of it to mind. If a thing happened recently, it feels likely, and we guard against it. If a thing has not happened in a long time, it feels unlikely, and our guard drops. And here is the lethal part, the part Gutentag and Herring made precise. The longer it has been since the last disaster, the lower our estimate of its probability falls, and it keeps falling. As the years of calm accumulate, the subjective probability of the catastrophe does not stay flat. It declines, year after quiet year, until at some point it effectively reaches zero. Not because the actual risk has gone away. The actual risk has not moved at all. The ocean is exactly as dangerous as it always was. But our sense of the risk decays with the passage of uneventful time, until the institution is most certain it is safe at precisely the moment it has gone longest without a reminder, which is precisely the moment it is most overdue. Read that against the Jogan tsunami one more time. 1,000-year recurrence interval, the last one in 869. By the time the plant was designed, the coast had gone roughly 1,100 years without a giant wave. 11 centuries of calm. 11 centuries of the subjective probability sliding towards zero in every human mind that contemplated it, while the actual probability climbed, because every quiet year on a 1,000-year cycle does not make the next disaster less likely. It makes it more. The institution felt safest exactly when the ground was most loaded. The recent record, the only record the human nervous system instinctively trusts, was a record of calm, because the human record on that coast was shorter than the interval between catastrophes. They were living inside the silence between two waves, and they mistook the silence for safety. That is disaster myopia, and it is not Japanese. It is human. It is in you. Right now, your sense of which catastrophes to prepare for is being set automatically beneath your awareness by how recently you have seen them, not by how likely they are. The pandemic that felt impossible in 2019 and obvious in 2020 and is already sliding back toward impossible. The 100-year flood that gets built next to anyway, because the last one was before anyone living can remember. The financial crash that the system swears cannot happen again, right up until the decade of calm has lulled everyone into the leverage that guarantees it. Disaster myopia is why the worst events keep finding us unprepared, not because they are unforeseeable, because the foreseeing decays. There is a companion to this idea from a different field that explains the second half of the mechanism, the part where the warning is not just forgotten, but actively dismissed in the room. The sociologist Diane Vaughan studied the Challenger space shuttle disaster, the explosion in 1986 that killed 7 astronauts, and she found that the engineers had not missed the danger. They had normalized it. She called it the normalization of deviance, and her definition is precise. It is the process by which a dangerous condition, repeated often enough without catastrophe, gradually stops being perceived as dangerous at all. The first time the shuttle's seals showed damage and the mission survived, the damage was alarming. The 5th time, it was a known issue. The 20th time, it was just a thing the shuttle did. The deviation from safety became the new definition of normal, because nothing had blown up yet. Until something did. Fukushima ran for 40 years, without a tsunami overtopping the wall. 40 years of the 5.7-meter wall being, apparently, fine. 40 years of the basement generators staying dry. Every uneventful year was a small confirmation that the design was adequate, that the warriors were wrong, that the warnings from the sediment were academic. The absence of disaster was read continuously as evidence of safety, when it was nothing of the kind. It was just the silence between waves, again, the same silence that had fooled everyone since 869, dressed up now in the authority of an operating record. The plant had not survived 40 years because it was safe. It had survived 40 years because the wave had not come yet. Those are completely different facts, and the entire institution had quietly substituted the first for the second. And there is a sentence from a Japanese nuclear official that captures the deepest layer of this. The place where the myopia stops being an accident and becomes almost a philosophy. Years before the disaster, a prominent nuclear engineer named Haruki Madarame, who would later become the chairman of the country's Nuclear Safety Commission, testified in a court case about whether a plant should have to prepare for the simultaneous failure of all its backup power. And he said, in defense of not requiring it, that if you took all these possibilities into account, you could never build anything. Sit with that, because the man is not wrong, and that is what makes it terrible. If you genuinely prepared for every low probability catastrophe, every 1,000-year wave, every simultaneous failure, you would never build anything at all. The cost would be infinite. At some point, every engineer, every institution, every person has to draw a line and say, beyond this point, the risk is too remote to spend money on. The line is not optional. You cannot live without drawing it. And the entire question, the only question that matters, is where you draw it. And disaster myopia guarantees that you will draw it in the wrong place, too close, every time. Because your sense of where the real risk lies has been quietly corroded by however long it has been since the last catastrophe. Madarame was describing the necessity of the line. He just drew it, like almost everyone draws it, on the near side of the wave. This is the point in the story where I have to make it about you, because the framework demands it, and because it is true. You draw this line constantly. You drew it this week. Every time you decided not to do the maintenance, not to back up the files, not to get the scan, not to build the savings buffer for the job loss that has not come, not to fix the thing that has not broken yet. You ran a private version of the same calculation that left the generators in the basement. You weighed a certain cost today against an uncertain catastrophe someday. And the uncertainty of the catastrophe, the fact that it has not happened, that it has been fine so far, made it feel safe to wait. And usually, it is fine. That is the cruelest part. Disaster myopia is not even irrational most of the time. Most of the time, the wave does not come, and the person who skipped the upgrade looks smart, and the person who insisted on it looks like Hirai. Difficult and expensive and obsessed with ghosts. The myopia is rewarded again and again, right up until the one time it is not, and the one time it is not erases everything. The official Japanese investigation into the disaster, when it tried to explain how this had happened, reached for an explanation about Japan. Its chairman wrote a famous and painful passage describing the disaster as made in Japan, rooted in what he called ingrained conventions of Japanese culture, a reflexive obedience, a reluctance to question authority, a devotion to sticking with the program, a groupism, an insularity. And I understand why he wrote it. He was a Japanese man indicting his own society, and there was courage in that. But I think the framing is itself a form of the same disease. And this is the misconception I most want to correct before we reach the end. To call it made in Japan is to do to the disaster what the institution did to the Jogan tsunami. It is to file it as a local, historic, contained event. A thing that happened to them, over there, because of who they are. It is to make it not your problem. It is your problem. The reflexive deference to authority, the reluctance to be the one who raises the alarm, the groupism, the comfort of sticking with the program, these are not Japanese traits. They are human traits, and they are present in every institution you have ever worked inside, including yours, especially the ones that feel nothing like Japan. The disaster was not made in Japan. It was made in the structure of how human institutions handle a risk that is real, expensive to prevent, and not yet visible. And that structure is everywhere. It is in the building you are sitting in. It is in the systems your life depends on. The same investigation that reached for Japanese culture also reached more quietly for the better explanation when it described the cause as an organization-driven mindset. A way of thinking that any organization anywhere can fall into. That sentence travels. The made in Japan sentence does not. Pay attention to which one the world chose to remember, because choosing to remember the comforting, localizing one, the one that makes it their flaw and not ours, is disaster myopia, operating on the story of disaster myopia itself. We even forget the lesson about forgetting. So we are left with a disaster that everyone could see coming, that one man on the same coast actually prepared for. That was written in a 1,000-year-old book and in the sand and in a calculation dated 3 years before the wave, and that happened anyway, because the structure of incentives made the under-preparation rational for every individual inside it. And because the human mind systematically loses its grip on a danger that has not shown itself recently. Which leaves one question, the one the whole thing has been building toward. If the disaster was foreseeable and foreseen and still not prevented, then somebody must have failed. So a court spent years trying to find that somebody, and what the court found, in the end, is the most disturbing thing in this entire story. Before the court, though, there was a commission, and there was a man, and I have been holding him back because he is the closest thing this story has to a conscience, and conscience belongs near the end. His name is Kiyoshi Kurokawa. He was born in 1936. He is not a nuclear engineer. He is a physician, a doctor of medicine, trained at the University of Tokyo, a former president of the Science Council of Japan, a man who spent years of his career teaching medicine in the United States before returning home. And in late 2011, the Japanese parliament did something it had never done in the entire history of the country's constitutional government. It established an independent commission, answerable not to the government and not to the company, but to the legislature itself, to investigate the disaster. The Nuclear Accident Independent Investigation Commission. And it put Kurokawa in charge. This had never happened before. For the first time, an investigative body in Japan was given real legislative power, including the power to compel testimony and demand documents. And Kurokawa used it. His commission held more than 900 hours of hearings. It interviewed more than 1,100 people. It surveyed more than 10,000 residents of the affected area and thousands of the workers who had been inside the plant during the accident. It visited the site. It requested thousands of documents. And here is a detail that tells you what it was up against. On more than 10 occasions, the commission had to formally order the regulator and the company to hand over information they were withholding. The investigation into the disaster had to fight the institutions responsible for the disaster, using subpoena power just to see the records. The reflex to protect the village did not end when the village melted down. It continued into the inquiry against the inquiry. When the report came out in July of 2012, it did not hedge. It is one of the bluntest official documents I have ever read, and its central sentence is the one I want carved into the front of this entire story. The accident, it said, was a profoundly man-made disaster that could and should have been foreseen and prevented. Not a natural disaster, not an act of God, not an event beyond human expectation, a man-made disaster, foreseeable, preventable, and then it went further, into the territory of accusation. The governments, the regulators, and the company, it found, had lacked a sense of responsibility to protect people's lives. They had, in its words, effectively betrayed the nation's right to be safe from nuclear accidents. Therefore, the report concluded, the accident was clearly man-made. For naming it that plainly, in a society where naming it that plainly was a genuine transgression, Kurokawa was given the American Association for the Advancement of Science Award for Scientific Freedom and Responsibility, an award whose citation praised his courage in challenging the most ingrained conventions of his own country's governance. He had done the rarest thing an insider can do. He had told the truth about the structure he was part of, on the record, with his name on it. He was, in a sense, the Hirai of the aftermath, the one who refused the comfortable version. And like Hirai, he was, in the end, walked past. Because naming the disaster man-made and getting a society to act on the naming are two completely different things, and the second one did not happen. Now I have to tell you who actually died, because the disaster's body count is itself a lesson in how we misperceive these events, and it is one final correction before the ending. When you picture the deaths from a nuclear meltdown, you picture radiation. You picture the invisible poison, the cancers, the slow sickness. And here is the fact that almost no one knows, and that reframes the entire catastrophe. The official, direct radiation death toll from the Fukushima meltdowns in the immediate accident was essentially 0. The radiation, as terrible as the contamination was, as many homes as it rendered uninhabitable, did not kill people in the way the public imagination insists it did. That is not the company's defense. It is the investigators' finding, and it makes the story worse, not better, because of what did kill people. What killed people was the evacuation. The criminal case that eventually went to trial centered on 44 deaths. 44 people, most of them elderly, many of them already sick, patients in a hospital and residents of a nursing home near the plant, who died not from radiation, but from the chaos of being moved, hurriedly, without adequate planning, away from the invisible danger. They died in the transport, or soon after, of the cold, the disruption, the loss of care, the sheer physical trauma of ripping frail bodies out of their beds and into the panic of an unplanned mass evacuation. And in the broader population of Fukushima evacuees, over the following years, Japanese authorities counted more than 2,000 deaths classified as disaster-related. Deaths among the displaced, the great majority of them people over 66. Deaths caused not by the earthquake, not by the tsunami, not by radiation, but by the conditions of being uprooted. More than 160,000 people fled. Many never returned. Some of the towns are still empty. So the meltdown killed, overwhelmingly, through fear and displacement rather than through radiation. Which means it killed through the cascade of consequences that flowed from a plant being where it should not have been, protected by a wall that was too short. Because of a calculation that was shelved, because of an incentive structure that rewarded shelving it. The 44 who died in the evacuation died because the basement generators drowned, because the cliff was cut, because the pumps were expensive, because the wall matched the wrong century. The chain is long, and every link is bureaucratic, and at the end of it are 44 dead people who were moved too fast out of beds they should never have had to leave. There is a contested question I have to flag, because the channel does not paper over genuine uncertainty, and because it bears on responsibility. The official line, the company's line, is that the earthquake itself did no critical damage to the reactors, and that everything that went wrong flowed from the tsunami and the lost power. But Kurokawa's commission was not willing to accept that, and called for further investigation into whether the magnitude 9 earthquake had itself damaged crucial systems before the wave even arrived. This matters, and it remains genuinely disputed, because if the shaking alone could cripple the plant, then the whole question of tsunami walls is almost a distraction, and the plant was vulnerable in even deeper ways than the wave revealed. The company has every incentive to insist it was only the tsunami, because the tsunami can be called unforeseeable, while a plant that cannot survive its own region's earthquakes is a far more damning thing. The honest position is that we do not fully know, that the company's account serves the company's interest, and that the people who could compel a definitive answer have not done so, which is, itself, the abdication of authority appearing one more time. Count it, that is 3, and we are not even at the trial yet. I keep using that phrase, the abdication of authority, and I want to be precise about what I mean by it now that you have seen it recur. Because it is not the same as corruption, and it is not the same as incompetence. It is the specific situation where the people who are supposed to be the responsible adults in the room, the ones with the expertise and the mandate and the duty, encounter the hard problem and, instead of solving it, hand it onward. The regulator hands the tsunami question back to the company for more study. The company hands it to the Civil Engineers Society for more review. The expert panel hears the objection and promises a follow-up that becomes an approval. Everyone treats the problem as real enough to pass along and never real enough to stop and solve. The hot potato of a 15.7-meter wave gets handed around a circle of qualified, intelligent, well-meaning professionals for years, and not one of them is ever holding it when the music stops, because the structure is designed so that no one ever has to be. That is the abdication. Not a refusal to act, a diffusion of responsibility so complete that there is no longer any single point in the system where the buck stops. And the genius of it, the truly dark genius, is that it means when the disaster finally comes, there is no one to blame, because everyone only ever did the reasonable, partial, defensible thing in front of them. Which brings us, at last, to the court, because a society that has suffered a man-made disaster, that has been told by its own parliament that the catastrophe could and should have been prevented, will eventually demand that someone be held responsible. It is the most human demand there is. Somebody did this. Find them. Make them answer. And the Japanese legal system spent more than a decade trying to honor that demand. Trying to take the diffuse, structural, everywhere and nowhere failure I have just described and condense it down to a name, a person, a defendant who could stand up in a courtroom and be held to account. And what happened when they tried is the final vertiginous turn of this story, the place where the ground gives way completely. It almost did not happen at all. The professional prosecutors, the state's own lawyers, looked at the disaster and twice declined to bring criminal charges against anyone. Twice they decided there was not enough to go on, that the case could not be won, that the responsibility was too diffuse to pin on any individual, and that should have been the end of it. The professionals had spoken. No one would stand trial for the worst nuclear accident in a quarter of a century. What forced the trial was one of the strangest and most admirable features of the Japanese legal system, a mechanism designed precisely to stop the powerful from escaping through the diffusion of blame. It is called the Committee for the Inquest of Prosecution, and it is, in essence, a jury of ordinary citizens, selected by lottery, given the power to overrule a prosecutor's decision not to charge. Regular people, pulled at random from the population, the way you might be pulled for jury duty, handed the file and asked whether the state's refusal to prosecute was right. And these randomly chosen citizens, twice, looked at what the prosecutors had set aside and said no. They voted to force an indictment. The professionals said let it go. The lottery winners said make them answer. And so, against the judgment of the entire professional legal apparatus, 3 former executives of the company were ordered to stand trial. The lead lawyer pressing the case, a man named Yuichi Kaido, who had spent years on it, put the charge in a single sentence that cuts to the bone. The executives, he said, had done the calculations themselves and then hidden them for 3 years. That is the accusation in its purest form. Not that they failed to foresee the wave, that they foresaw it in their own internal numbers and buried the foreseeing. The 15.7-meter figure was not an outside warning they neglected. It was their own work, commissioned by their own company, reported to their own desks, and shelved by their own decision. They were not being tried for blindness. They were being tried for looking, seeing, and choosing the short wall anyway. The trial ran for years, and in September of 2019, the court delivered its verdict. Not guilty. All three acquitted. The court reasoned that the men could not have been expected to foresee a tsunami of that magnitude with enough certainty to justify shutting down the plant. The government's long-term earthquake assessment, the one that had generated the 15.7-meter number, was, the court found, not reliable enough to have compelled action. The very uncertainty I described earlier, the genuine scientific doubt about the estimate, became the legal shield. The number was real, but it was not certain, and because it was not certain, the court found no reasonable executive was obligated to bet the operation of the plant on it. The uncertainty that had given them permission to wait now gave them permission to walk. The man forced to trial by ordinary citizens was set free by the professional bench. Kaido, the lawyer, called it an unfair verdict, said the only way to read it was that the court had issued an unjust ruling. Outside the courthouse, people who had lost their homes, who had buried relatives who died in the evacuation, who had spent 8 years waiting for someone to be held responsible, stood and absorbed the word, not guilty. The criminal law had looked at the diffuse, structural, everywhere and nowhere failure, and it had done exactly what the structure was built to make it do. It had found no one holding the potato. The acquittals were later upheld. One of the 3 men died before the legal process fully ended, his case closed by his death. The criminal accountability for the disaster that a parliamentary commission had called profoundly man-made and entirely preventable came, in the end, to nothing. No one was criminally guilty. The man-made disaster had no man who made it. But that is not the end of the legal story, and here is where it stops being merely bleak and becomes genuinely vertiginous, because the law could not even hold still in its own conclusion. While the criminal case was acquitting everyone, a separate civil case was working its way through a different court. A group of shareholders of the company, people who had owned the stock and watched the disaster destroy its value, sued the executives directly, demanding they personally compensate the company for what their negligence had cost. And in July of 2022, 3 years after the criminal acquittal, a different court, looking at much the same evidence, reached the opposite conclusion. It found 4 former executives liable. It found that they had fundamentally lacked safety awareness and a sense of responsibility. It found that they could have prevented the disaster, that the countermeasures were feasible, that other plants in Japan had implemented exactly the kind of flood protection that would have saved Fukushima, including making the critical buildings watertight, and that these men had failed in their duty to order it. And it ordered them to pay. The figure it named is almost impossible to absorb. 13.3 trillion yen, somewhere around $94 billion. The largest civil damages award in the history of Japan, by an enormous margin, dwarfing every previous record. 4 individuals ordered personally to pay a sum that no individuals could ever conceivably pay, as a measure of the scale of what their decisions had set in motion. So now hold the 2 verdicts in your head at the same time, because the same disaster, examined by the same legal system, produced both. A criminal court that found the men not guilty because the wave was not foreseeable with enough certainty, and a civil court that found the men liable for $94 billion because the wave was foreseeable and they failed to prevent it. Not guilty and catastrophically responsible for the same act, in the same country, under the same law. The system could not decide. It looked at the calculation, the shelving, the bodies, the buried report, all of it, and it returned, formally, two opposite answers, and let them both stand. And then, because this story refuses every resting place, the law moved one more time. In 2025, a higher court took up the appeal of that record-breaking civil verdict, and it overturned it. The 13.3 trillion yen judgment was struck down. The higher court found, once again, that the executives could not have sufficiently foreseen the tsunami, that the government assessment did not provide a firm enough basis to demand protection against a 15-meter wave. The largest damages award in the history of the country, the one concrete instance in which any human being had been held to account for the disaster, was erased, reversed, vacated, as though it had never been. The plaintiffs said they would appeal to the Supreme Court. The question of whether anyone is responsible for Fukushima is, as I speak to you, still formally open, still being handed upward through the courts, still unresolved more than a decade later. The legal hot potato, now circling at the highest levels of the judiciary, the same way the engineering hot potato once circled the meeting rooms. I want you to see what that legal chaos actually means, because it is not just a story about courts disagreeing. It is the deepest confirmation of everything that came before. The reason the law cannot decide whether anyone is responsible is that the disaster genuinely was produced by a structure rather than a person. The diffusion of responsibility that I described inside the institution. The abdication where everyone did the reasonable partial thing and no one was ever holding the problem when it mattered. That diffusion is real, and the courts are running into it, hard, from the outside. When the law goes looking for the guilty individual, it finds, exactly as the structure was designed to ensure, a chain of reasonable people, each making a defensible local decision. And it cannot locate the point where reasonable became criminal, because there is no such point. There is no pixel in the image where you can say, here, this is where the disaster was decided. It was decided everywhere and nowhere, by the shape of the incentives, over decades, and a court cannot convict a shape. That is why the verdicts contradict each other. They are not two readings of the facts. They are two different answers to an unanswerable question. The question I asked you to hold at the very beginning and warned you would slip. When a catastrophe is foreseeable and foreseen and written down and still not prevented, who failed? And the honest answer, the answer the contradicting courts are circling without being able to say, is the one no legal system is built to deliver. Everyone failed a little, in a way that was individually rational, and the sum of those rational little failures was a region made uninhabitable and 44 people dead in the backs of ambulances. No one failed enough to convict. The failure was in the structure, and the structure had no body to put in the dock. Here is the part where, if this were an ordinary documentary, I would reassure you. I would tell you that lessons were learned, that the regulator was reformed, that it could not happen again. And it is true that Japan dissolved the captured regulator and built a new, more independent one in 2012. That is real, and it matters. But it would be a lie of the worst kind, the comforting kind, to let you finish this thinking that the problem was a Japanese regulator and the solution was a better Japanese regulator. Because the structure that built the short wall is not an artifact of one country's bureaucracy. It is the default condition of human institutions facing a rare and expensive catastrophe. And I can prove it to you by counting. because the same disaster, the same shape, the same buried calculation, and the same overridden warning keeps happening everywhere, on every continent, in every system you depend on, over and over, with different victims. In the year 2004, a tsunami in the Indian Ocean killed roughly 230,000 people across more than a dozen countries. The Pacific had a tsunami warning network. The Indian Ocean did not, despite scientists having pointed out the gap, because a giant tsunami there was a rare event, a low-frequency catastrophe. And the warning system was a present cost guarding against an absent disaster, and the subjective probability had slid towards zero in exactly the way two Princeton economists had described. The wave came, and there was no warning, because no one had been incentivized to build the warning for a wave that had not come in living memory. In 2005, the city of New Orleans drowned. Not because the hurricane was unforeseeable, the vulnerability of the levees was known. There had been a federally funded exercise, a simulation, the year before that had modeled almost exactly the catastrophe that then occurred. A major hurricane overwhelming the city's defenses and trapping tens of thousands. The simulation foresaw it. The levees were not strengthened in time, because strengthening them was an enormous present cost against a flood that had not yet come, and roughly 1,800 people died inside the foreseeing. In 1975, in China, the Banqiao Dam failed in a storm and unleashed a flood that killed, by some estimates, more than 170,000 people. The dam had been built to survive what the engineers called a 1,000-year flood. Except their estimate of what a 1,000-year flood looked like was based on a hydrological record far too short to contain one. The same error as the tide gauge at Onagawa, the same mistake of building against the recent measured past rather than the deep actual past. And the storm that came was larger than their too short record had taught them to imagine. In 2021, the power grid of Texas collapsed in a winter storm, and hundreds of people died, many of them freezing in their own homes. The grid had failed in almost the same way in a freeze 10 years earlier. The regulators had been warned, in writing, to require the power plants to be winterized against exactly this. Winterization was a present cost against a freeze that, in the warm years between, felt increasingly improbable. It was not mandated. The freeze returned, larger, and the foreseeing was already on file. I could keep counting. The coal tip that buried a village school in Wales in 1966 and killed 144 people, 116 of them children, after years of warnings that the tip was unstable and sliding toward the school. The bridges that collapse a few years after the maintenance budget is cut. The financial system that detonates a decade after the last crash convinced everyone the old dangers were obsolete, which is the precise field the disaster Myopia paper was written about in the first place. The pattern does not vary. A rare, severe, expensive to prevent catastrophe. A warning, often a precise one, sometimes a calculation with a number on it. A present cost to prevent it, and no reward for the prevention. An institution whose incentives all point toward waiting. A stretch of calm that quietly convinces everyone the danger has passed. And then the catastrophe, on schedule, finding everyone unprepared, followed by a report concluding it could and should have been foreseen, followed by a return to exactly the same behavior. Because the report does not change the incentives, and the incentives are the disaster. This is the thing I most need you to take from all of this, and it is the opposite of reassuring. so I am not going to dress it up. Fukushima was not a failure of the system. That is the comfortable reading, the one that lets you sleep, the one that says something broke and can be fixed. Fukushima was the system working. The wall was the correct height for the incentives that built it. Every person in the chain behaved rationally. The regulator that filed the number rather than reviewing it, the executive who sent the calculation back for more study, the engineer who chose the basement for the generators, the official who called the ancient wave historic. Every one of them was doing the locally sensible, individually defensible, professionally rewarded thing. The disaster did not happen because the system malfunctioned. It happened because the system functioned exactly as designed, and what it was designed to do, underneath everything, was to defer the expensive truth onto someone else's afternoon. It built the short wall on purpose. It just did not call it that. And the same system is running right now. This is the third time I have brought you to your own life, and it is the last, and I want it to land with the full weight, because the framework of this channel does not let me end on the plant. Somewhere, today, on a coast you have never seen, an engineer is choosing a wall height, and the cheaper number is winning. And the calculation that says it should be higher is being sent back for more study. Somewhere a regulator who would like a job at the company someday is deciding not to push too hard. Somewhere a maintenance budget is being deferred one more year because the bridge has been fine for 40. And in your own life, in the small and unglamorous decisions you make about the catastrophes you have decided are too unlikely to spend money on, you are drawing the same line, on the near side of the same wave, for the same reasons, with the same quiet confidence that comes from the fact that it has been fine so far. You are not different from the men who built that wall. You are running the same software. The only difference is that your wave has not come yet. I have spent most of this story in meeting rooms and courtrooms and the cold arithmetic of incentives, because that is where the disaster was actually made. But the disaster was not paid for in meeting rooms. It was paid for in the dark, on the night of the 11th of March and the days that followed, by a few dozen men who stayed inside a plant that the structure above them had refused to protect, and who tried, with their hands and with car batteries and with flashlights, to hold back a catastrophe that the incentives had spent 20 years guaranteeing. I want to take you in there, because the contrast between how the disaster was made and how it was fought is the most morally clarifying thing in the entire story. When the wave took the power, it did not just take the generators, it took the lights, it took the instruments. The control room of a nuclear reactor is a wall of gauges and dials telling the operators what is happening inside the core. The temperature, the pressure, the water level, and when the power died, the wall went dark. The men responsible for 3 melting reactors suddenly could not see inside them. They were flying blind, in a room lit by flashlights they had brought from home or scavenged, trying to manage the most dangerous machines ever built by reading instruments that no longer reported anything. So they improvised. They went out into the parking lot, in the dark, after the tsunami, and they took the batteries out of their own cars, and they carried them back into the plant and wired them to the instrument panels to coax a few readings out of the dead gauges. Car batteries. The men holding the line against a triple meltdown were stripping their own vehicles for 12-volt batteries because the institution that ran the plant had put the real power supply in a basement below a wave it had calculated and chosen to ignore. The man in charge inside the plant was the site superintendent, Masao Yoshida. And Yoshida is the figure in this story who, for me, finally makes the abstraction of incentives concrete, because of one decision he made in the worst hours. a decision that contains the entire disaster in a single human choice. As the cores overheated, the only thing left to cool them with was seawater, not the clean, treated water the reactors normally used. Raw seawater, pumped in from the ocean in desperation, through fire engines, because everything else was gone. And here is the thing about flooding a nuclear reactor with seawater. It works. It can cool the core, but the salt destroys the reactor permanently. Pump the ocean into a reactor, and you have, in that act, written it off forever. Turned a multi-billion-dollar asset into a ruined hulk that can never run again. Seawater is the cooling method of someone who has decided the machine is already lost, and only the catastrophe remains to be prevented. Yoshida started the seawater injection, and the company headquarters, on the video link, in the middle of the meltdown, told him to stop. The order to halt the seawater came down to him while the core was uncovering, and the reason it came down, the reason anyone hesitated about the one thing that might cool the reactor, was that injecting the seawater meant accepting the permanent loss of the reactor, the financial write-off, the admission that this unit was gone for good. Even then, even in the middle of the disaster, with the core melting, the same logic that had built the short wall reached into the control room and tried to stop the cooling. Because the cooling was expensive, and admitting the loss was expensive, and maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to save the asset. The incentive structure did not switch off when the meltdown began. It followed them into the dark. Yoshida, on the video link, said he would comply. And then he turned to the subordinate beside him and quietly told him to keep the seawater flowing. And he kept it flowing, in defiance of the instruction from above, because he was standing in the room with the reactor and he understood that the time for protecting assets was over and the only thing left to protect was everything else. He disobeyed. He kept pumping the ocean into the ruined core. And it is one of the reasons the disaster, as terrible as it was not worse. The man at the bottom of the structure, with the least incentive of anyone to care about the company's balance sheet, because he was busy trying not to die, made the decision the entire chain above him had spent decades structurally avoiding. He chose the catastrophe over the cost. He chose it in seconds, in the dark, with the core melting, while his superiors on the screen were still doing the math that had built the wall. Masao Yoshida died in July of 2013, a little more than 2 years after the disaster, of esophageal cancer at the age of 58. The company stated that his illness was not related to his radiation exposure during the accident, and the timing makes that medically plausible. But there is an ironic parallel here that I cannot stop turning over. This kind of story always seems to produce. The man who stayed in the poisoned dark to hold back the meltdown, who stripped the structure's failures down to a personal act of disobedience and saved what could be saved, did not live to see even the first verdict in the long legal fight over who was responsible. He was gone before the trials really began. The men who shelved the calculation in the comfort of 2008 outlived, in freedom and in health. The man who cleaned up what their shelving produced. Hirai built the wall higher and died 25 years before the wave proved him right. Yoshida held the line and died before the courts could finish failing to assign blame. The people in this story who saw clearly and acted, the engineer and the superintendent, both died before vindication. The people who looked away were, for the most part, fine. There is a pattern in who pays, and it is the same pattern as who pays in every one of the disasters I counted for you, and it is worth naming directly, because the structure works very hard to keep it unnamed. The people who design the underprotection and the people who suffer the catastrophe are almost never the same people. The executive who shelves the calculation in 2008 is not standing in the control room in 2011. The regulator who files the number rather than reviewing it is not in the nursing home that has to be evacuated. The savings are captured now by the institution and its decision makers in the form of lower costs and smoother operations and careers that advance on budgets kept lean. The catastrophe is paid later by other people entirely. The 44 who died in the ambulances, the 160,000 who lost their homes, the superintendent who stayed in the dark, the towns that are still empty. The incentive structure does not just defer the cost in time, it transfers it across people. The ones who decide are insulated from the ones who pay. And a system in which the deciders are protected from the consequences of their deciding is a system that will, with the reliability of a physical law, decide to underprotect every single time forever. Because for the deciders, underprotection is not a risk, it is a saving. The risk belongs to someone else. That is the machine. That is the whole machine, finally assembled, every part of it. The recent record that feels like the whole record. The deep history filed as a curiosity. The calculation that gets sent back for more study. The uncertainty that becomes permission. The regulator who would like a job someday. The savings captured now by the people who decide. The catastrophe paid later by the people who do not. The myopia that makes the danger fade with every quiet year. And the silence between the waves, mistaken, every time, on every coast, in every century, for safety. Put it all together, and it does not produce a mistake. It produces a wall, a specific wall, 5.7 meters tall, exactly as tall as the incentives wanted it, and not 1 centimeter taller, standing in front of a plant, waiting for a wave that everyone had the means to see and no reason to prepare for. And the wave was already coming. It had been coming since 869. It was always going to come. The only thing anyone got to decide was how high the wall would be when it arrived. And they decided. And now you know exactly why they decided the way they did. And that knowledge is the thing I cannot give back to you, and would not if I could. Here is what happened to the walls after the wave. This is the part that should remove the last of your comfort, because it is the part where you watch the cycle reset in real time, with the lessons supposedly fresh, with the bodies barely buried. After the disaster, Japan found the money, all of it. The money that could not be justified for a higher wall at Fukushima in 2008, the money that would have interfered with operations and weakened the company in lawsuits, the money that no individual in the chain had any incentive to spend, suddenly appeared in staggering quantities the moment the wave had already come. Along the Tohoku coast, the country built a wall of seawalls, hundreds of kilometers of new concrete barriers, some of them over 14 meters high, some higher, great grey ramparts thrown up along the shoreline of villages that had already been destroyed. The cost of cleaning up and compensating for the disaster has been estimated at somewhere between 20 trillion and 70 trillion yen. Figures so large they stop meaning anything. Hundreds of billions of dollars, a sum that would have built the higher wall at every nuclear plant in the country thousands of times over. The protection that was too expensive to build before the catastrophe became, after it, simply the price of doing business, paid without hesitation. Because now the wave was real. Now it was in the recent record. Now everyone could see it, because it had already happened. That is disaster myopia closing its loop. The protection is impossible to justify until the disaster makes it obvious, at which point it is too late to help the people the disaster already killed, and it gets built anyway for the next wave as a monument to the last one. The dead do not benefit from the wall built after they drown. The wall is for a future that now feels frightening, because the past just demonstrated what the ocean can do. And here is the cruelest turn of the screw, the thing that should keep you up. The new walls, the 14-meter walls along the Tohoku coast, are built against the 2011 wave. They are sized for the catastrophe that just happened. And the 2011 wave is now the recent record, the vivid one, the one the human nervous system trusts. Which means that somewhere out in deep time, in the geology, there is almost certainly a wave larger than 2011. A wave on a longer cycle, written in older sand, and the new walls are not built for that one, because that one has not happened in living memory. Because the subjective probability of it has already started its slide towards zero. Because the cycle does not end, it just resets one disaster higher and begins forgetting again. They will tell you the new regulator fixed the institutional problem. In 2012, Japan abolished the captured agency that had filed the number rather than reviewing it, and created a new nuclear regulation authority, deliberately moved out from under the ministry that promoted nuclear power, given more independence, more teeth. And that is a genuine improvement. I will not pretend otherwise. But notice the shape of it. The reform happened after the disaster, in response to the disaster, sized to the disaster. The independence that was unthinkable in 2008 became mandatory in 2012. Not because anyone discovered a new argument for it. The arguments had all been made before, by the international inspectors who flagged the conflict of interest years early and were politely ignored, but because the catastrophe had finally made the old arguments feel urgent. The regulator was reformed for the same reason the walls were raised. The wave had come. And a reform that requires the wave to come first is not a solution to disaster myopia. It is disaster myopia with a longer fuse. It fixes the last failure. It does nothing about the structure that guarantees the next one, in some other domain, on some other coast, where the catastrophe has not yet supplied the political will to prevent it. In October of 2024, the Onagawa plant, Hirai plant, the one that survived, restarted one of its reactors after years of safety upgrades. The plant built by the man who read the deep history is running again. The plant built against the recent record melted down and will be decommissioned over a span of decades, its ruined cores still too hot and too radioactive to fully remove. A 40-year cleanup of a 40-minute failure of foresight. 2 plants, 2 philosophies on the same coast, and the ocean has already told you which philosophy was correct. But the philosophy that was correct, Hirai's philosophy, the one that takes the deep history literally and spends real money on a wave outside living memory, is exactly the philosophy that no normal incentive structure will ever reward, because in the overwhelming majority of cases, on any given decade, the Hirai of the story looks like a fool. He spent the money. The wave did not come on his watch. He died, and for 25 years, he was just the man who had insisted on an absurdly expensive wall for a tsunami that never showed up. The vindication required the catastrophe. Being right about a 1,000-year wave means being fool to fool for centuries, and correct for a single afternoon, and dead for the verdict. So how do you fix it? I have led you all the way down here, and you are entitled to ask whether there is a way out. And the honest answer, the one the channel does not let me dress up, is that I do not think there is a clean one. Because the problem is not ignorance, and it is not even greed. It is the structure of how a present, certain cost is weighed against a future. Uncertain catastrophe by institutions whose decision makers are insulated from the catastrophe and rewarded for the saving. You could change the incentives. You could make the deciders personally liable, the way that one civil court briefly tried to before a higher court erased it. You could give the he-rise of the world real power and protect them from being overridden by the village. You could force the deep history into the design codes by law, so the 1,000-year wave is not optional. People propose these things. Some of them even get built after a disaster for a while, until the memory fades and the costs start to feel unjustified again, and the rules get quietly relaxed in the long calm, because the long calm is when the relaxing always happens. The long calm is the most dangerous time. The long calm is the silence between the waves. Every fix is itself subject to the myopia it is trying to fix. We forget that we forget. That is the trap. That is why it keeps happening. The mechanism that causes the disaster also erodes the memory of the disaster and the will to prevent the next one, on a time scale that almost exactly matches the interval between catastrophes, as if the forgetting were tuned to the recurrence, as if the system were designed to be unprepared at precisely the moment it is most overdue. There is one more thing I have to make you feel before the end, because it is the precise center of the whole story, the exact mechanism named in the title. And if you leave without feeling it, then I have failed. Nobody was incentivized to ask why. I have shown you the incentives all the way along, the budgets and the careers and the lawsuits, but I have not shown you the deepest and strangest one, the asymmetry that sits underneath all the others, and that I think is genuinely close to a law of human institutions. It is this: a prevented catastrophe is invisible, and an invisible thing cannot be rewarded. Think about what success would have looked like for the person who insisted on the higher wall at Fukushima. Suppose someone in 2008 had won the argument. Suppose they had spent the money, raised the wall to 15 meters, moved the generators to high ground, hardened the cooling. And then suppose the 11th of March, 2011 arrived, and the wave came, and the wall held, and the plant shut down safely, and the region was fine, the way Onagawa was fine. What would that person have to show for it? Nothing. There would be no disaster. There would be no headline, because nothing happened. There would be no gratitude, because no one knows they were saved from a thing that did not occur. There would only be the memory, inside the institution, of the person who years earlier had insisted on spending an enormous amount of money on a wall that, as far as anyone could see, had never been needed, because the only proof that it was needed is the catastrophe that the wall prevented. And a prevented catastrophe leaves no proof. The successful prevention and the unnecessary expense are, from the inside, completely indistinguishable. They look exactly the same, a large bill and no disaster. That is what winning looks like, and that is what wasting money looks like, and you cannot tell them apart, ever. Because the disaster you prevented and the disaster that was never going to happen both leave precisely the same trace, which is nothing. This is the asymmetry that breaks everything. When you fail to prevent a catastrophe, the catastrophe is vivid, enormous, undeniable, and it has your name on it. When you succeed in preventing a catastrophe, the success is invisible, indistinguishable from waste. and it has no name at all. So the incentives are not merely tilted toward underprotection. They are tilted in a way that punishes the person who is right. The Hirai who builds the wall too high looks like a fool for decades and is vindicated only by the disaster, which is to say, only on the one day his entire career was designed to prevent. If the disaster never comes, he is never vindicated. He just dies as the man who overspent on a ghost. The reward for being right about a rare catastrophe is, in the overwhelming majority of timelines, indistinguishable from the punishment for being wrong about it. You spend your career, your credibility, your relationships, fighting for a wall and the best possible outcome. The outcome you are praying for is that nothing happens and everyone quietly concludes you were paranoid. The structure does not just fail to reward foresight, it actively cannot reward it, because foresight, when it works, erases its own evidence. Let me put a number on how lopsided this is, because the framework of this channel demands that the abstract be made visceral, and this one can be. The plant was protected against a wave that, on the geological record, arrives roughly once every 500 to 1,000 years. Call it once a millennium for the sake of the arithmetic. That means that in any given year, the chance of the catastrophic wave is something like 1 in 1,000, which means that an executive who shelves the wall is, in any given year, about 99.9% likely to be proven correct. To look smart, to have saved the money for nothing bad, a manager could make that exact decision, shelve that exact wall, every single year for an entire 40-year career, and the odds are overwhelming that the wave never comes on their watch, that they retire celebrated for their cost discipline, that they descend from heaven into a comfortable vice presidency, that they die thinking they were right, because for the length of a human career, they were right, almost every time. The myopia is not a bug in their judgment. It is a rational read of the odds over the timescale of a career. The wave is on a 1,000-year clock. The career is on a 40-year clock, and the person makes their decisions, every one of them, on the career clock, against a danger that only resolves on the 1,000-year clock, which means they will almost never personally live to see the bill come due, which means the bill is always, structurally, someone else's on some afternoon after they are gone. The mismatch between the length of a human career and the length of a tsunami cycle is not a detail. It is the engine. The disaster operates on a clock that no individual decision-maker will ever fully experience, so no individual decision-maker is ever the one holding it when it strikes. So no individual decision-maker is ever incentivized to prevent it. The clocks do not match. They were never going to match. And in the gap between the career clock and the catastrophe clock, the wall stays short. That is why nobody was incentivized to ask why. Not because they were bad, because the question why is a question that only pays off on a time scale longer than any of their careers, against a probability low enough to bet against every year, with a reward, even in success, that is invisible and indistinguishable from waste. Ask why, and the best case is you spend money and look paranoid. Do not ask why, and the overwhelmingly likely case is you save money and look prudent, and the small chance that you are catastrophically wrong will probably land on whoever is sitting in your chair after you are gone. Given those incentives, not asking why is not a moral failure. It is the correct move. It is what a rational person does. And that is the most frightening sentence in this entire story, more frightening than the wave, more frightening than the bodies. The short wall was the rational choice. They were not irrational. The structure was. And the structure is still standing. in every institution you depend on, perfectly rational, perfectly defensible. Building the next short wall this week, because the clocks still do not match, and they never will. I want to go back to where we started, because I promised you the beginning would feel different by the end, and it does. The wave had already happened once, in the year 869. Somebody wrote it down, and when I told you that at the start, it sounded like a tragedy of forgetting. A society had a warning and lost it, the way things get lost over 1100 years, and the loss killed people, and that is sad. That is the version you would have walked away with if you had stopped reading after the first few minutes. But that is not what happened, and you know that now. Nothing was lost. The chronicle was in the National Library the whole time. The sand was in the ground the whole time, under the ash, exactly where the wave left it, readable by anyone who dug. The recurrence interval was published in a scientific journal 10 years before the disaster. The calculation that put a number on it was sitting in a company office 3 years before the disaster. The man who took the deep history seriously built a plant up the coast that survived. And in a meeting in June of 2009, a scientist said out loud, on the record, that leaving the ancient wave out of the safety assessment was unacceptable, and they left it out anyway. This was not a failure of memory. The memory was intact. This was a failure of incentive, which is a different and much darker thing, because a failure of memory can be fixed by remembering, and a failure of incentive cannot be fixed by remembering, because everyone remembered. They remembered, and it did not matter. The knowledge was never the missing ingredient. The reward for acting on the knowledge was the missing ingredient. And it was missing by design, and it is missing right now. In the institutions you depend on, in the same shape, for the same reasons. So here is the thing I cannot stop thinking about. The thing this whole story finally comes down to, the implication I have been walking you toward since the 2 numbers. Somewhere right now, in an office you will never see, on a coast you will never visit. A person is looking at a calculation. The calculation says the wall should be higher, the budget should be larger, the system should be hardened against an event that has not happened in living memory and may not happen in theirs, and every incentive acting on that person, their budget, their career, their boss's boss, the smooth running of the operation, the absence of any reward for a catastrophe that does not occur, all of it is pushing them, gently, reasonably, defensibly toward the lower number. And they will almost certainly choose the lower number, not because they are stupid or evil, because they are responding correctly to the structure they are standing inside. The same structure that built a 5.7 meter wall in front of a 15.7 meter wave. They are building, at this moment, the seawall for the next disaster, and they are building it for the wrong century. And nobody is incentivized to ask why. You will not hear about it. That is the nature of it. You only ever hear about these walls after the wave, when the report comes out and concludes that it could and should have been foreseen, and everyone agrees, and the walls go up too late, sized to the catastrophe that already happened, while the calculation for the one after that gets sent back for more study. The decision that will kill people a decade from now is being made today, quietly, correctly, by someone with no reason to make it any other way, and there is no headline, because nothing has happened yet. Nothing has happened yet is the most dangerous sentence in any language. It is the sentence the silence between the waves whispers. In 869, and in 1960, and in 2008, right up until the water comes over the wall. And you do it too. I told you at the beginning that you had made the same trade probably this week, and you have had this whole time to decide whether to believe me. So let me close the loop. Every time you weighed a certain cost now against an uncertain disaster later, and let the uncertainty talk you out of the cost, you ran the calculation that left the generators in the basement, the maintenance you deferred, the savings you did not build, the scan you did not get, the hard conversation you did not have because things had been fine so far. You drew the line on the near side of your own wave for the same reason they did, with the same quiet confidence that comes from a record of calm too short to contain the thing that is actually coming. The men who built that wall are not a separate species. They are not a foreign culture. They are not the villains the courts went looking for and could not find. They are you, scaled up, with a reactor instead of a life, and the only thing that separates your record of getting away with it from theirs is that your wave has not arrived yet. The official inquiry called it a profoundly man-made disaster that could and should have been foreseen and prevented. And every word of that is true, and it is also, I think, the most comforting possible way to say what actually happened. Because man-made implies a man, and could have been prevented implies someone who failed to prevent it. And the search for that man and that someone is exactly what the courts have been unable to complete for over a decade. Returning verdicts that contradict each other, finding everyone responsible and no one guilty. Because there was no man and there was no someone. There was a structure. There was an incentive gradient. There was a slope that every reasonable person slid down, individually, defensively, toward the lower wall, and the sum of all those reasonable slides was a region you cannot live in and 44 people who died being carried out of their beds. The disaster was man-made the way a riverbed is water-made, not by any single drop, by all of them following the only path the ground allowed until the channel was cut. The chronicle is still in the library. The sand is still in the ground. The next wave already has a date on it, somewhere out in the deep history that no one is paid to read, written in a layer of sediment under a layer of ash, on a coast where the tide gauges have recorded nothing but calm for as long as anyone has been keeping records. The calculation for the wall that will fail to stop it is being finished this week. The number that would prevent it is being sent back for more study, and the people who will pay for it are not the people who are deciding it, which is the only reason it can be decided at all. You know how this works now. That is the thing you cannot give back. You will see it everywhere, in every deferred repair and every relaxed standard and every long calm that everyone mistakes for safety. And you will understand each time that the wave is already coming, that it was always coming, that the only question anyone ever gets to answer is how high the wall will be when it arrives. They answered 5.7. The ocean had written 15.7, 1100 years before, in the sand, under the ash, where anyone could read it. Nobody was paid to read it. Nobody is now.